Star Citizen is a game that emphasizes choice and the idea of risk versus reward. Rather than lay out strict rules, the game attempts to provide as many of the tools as it can to the player so that they can make the best decision for their end goal, whether that means making more money through criminal activities at the risk of prison time, or using a ship with 3 beds because you have friends to think about. It's all about specific needs and what you're willing to sacrifice for your situation. Atmospheric flight was always meant to take advantage of this system, but has had a bumpy road getting there. Welcome to Star Citizen Retrospective, a series of impromptu videos in which I analyze the past, present, and possible future of gameplay elements and features in Star Citizen, which may or may not have seen progress over the course of the years. Today we are going to talk about the atmospheric flight model. And before we get deep into it, I would like to say that I am officially starting my scheduled streams on Twitch, so I can play with you guys, see you face to, chat, and just have a more close relationship with my community. Side note, you'd be surprised at how long this graphic took. Thank you for coming to this Tomato Talk. While the flight model in Star Citizen has changed for the better and worse over the last several years, the atmospheric flight model has only really seen a proper inception in Alpha Patch 3.0. Since then, it has gone through a bit of an identity crisis. From August of 2016, ships were planned to act differently in atmosphere as opposed to space. The first implementation of this came in 3.0. This change had some effect on the way that ships handled, but didn't necessarily change the game. This was partially because atmospheric flight was still not a major part of the game with only 5 atmospheric bodies available, and partially because lift had still not been factored into the model. And while gravity and drag were said to be simulated at the time, the more specific aerodynamics are only now being properly implemented. At the time, a much more basic and less noticeable system had been implemented. Before this, the flight system would counteract the drag and gravity applied to your ship only to then reapply the same force it had just mitigated. A bit redundant, so this was a good change.
ISCS will actually work to remove those forces, allocating thrust to countering gravity and countering drag, and then having removed those forces, then it uses the same motion profiles that it would use in space to control a ship. So the result is you feel like you have less thrust available because it's being used for other things, and you definitely feel the turbulence, but overall it's still the same flight model that we have in space. Whereas the new model, I've actually already worked out the calculations for it. I just need to get it into the engine. Will actually include these additional forces, lift, drag, and gravity, in its calculations to carry out whatever actions that the player is trying to achieve. So for example, if you're sitting here and you want to go down, rather than countering gravity and then pushing you down, it'll just generate less upward thrust so that it just drops gently down, using gravity to your advantage.
See, the plan for the atmospheric flight system was always to utilize drag, lift, and gravity, which would enable effects such as slowing you down by banking your ship against the direction of travel, or feeling the difference in speed and strain on your ship based on whether you are flying with or against gravity and how much cargo is in your ship. That's right, the weight and distribution of said weight on your ship is meant to have an impact on the speed, maneuverability, and fuel consumption of the ship, while different materials will cause your ship to experience differences in armor reliability and maneuverability.
So if we make a ship out of plastic material, it will work out the volume and the mass of it from that based on the materials that are applied. So it will behave like a plastic ship versus someone like me putting 10 million tons in the XML.
So it's not just a measurement of the volume, which is kind of what we're doing now. It's the volume plus the material.
And
Lift, however, would not be implemented for years to come. and this material specification system is still being finalized for implementation. The main goal of the 3.5 rework was to differentiate the feeling of flying each ship both in and outside of atmosphere through the use of a more systemic and reactive flight model. You can see right away that the HUD looked a bit different after this update. Not only was backwards and forwards thrust held on the same throttle axis, this little dot here was meant to always be the target velocity of your ship's coupled speed regardless of whether you are touching the throttle or not. However, this feature was changed to be optional as cruise control before the update went live. And prior to 3.5, drag was a factor of atmospheric flight, but lift was a new addition to the experience. In addition to lift, the big rework introduced the interactivity of heat and power. This allowed pilots to experiment with thrust and power while conducting maneuvers in and outside of atmosphere. The system also included a complete rework of the audio feedback experienced from thrusters, atmosphere, and damage effects. All this being said, flight instability has always been rather hit or miss since then. While thrust is modeled to fire from each of our thrusters independently, the effect of having a damaged thruster, cycling power, or even losing a thruster altogether did not always reflect tangibly on your ability to fly, taking away the urgency of protecting such crucial parts of your ship. This is being changed with Alpha 3.10, but we'll discuss that later. The last big update to the atmospheric flight model was the introduction of hover mode in Alpha 3.6. When it was introduced in 2019, it was only a halfway solution to the VTOL scenario, one that was rather hit or miss when it came to player experiences. A big component that was missing from the implementation was heat, and the wear that hovering would put on ships' maneuvering thrusters. While heat was included in the flight model, it did not have an effect on the thrusters used to keep ships stable in stationary flight under gravitational effects. This diminished the advantage of owning a ship with a VTOL system, despite being a system that was planned since 2017.
So, with a vehicle that has VTOLs, you would expect that its plus Z maneuverability would be close to what you have in space, but without VTOLs, it would be significantly less.
Gotcha. And I know other developers have spoken that if you're flying in a ship that doesn't have VTOL and you're using your maneuvering thrusters to hover and whatnot, that when the wear and tear comes in for ship components, that's going to wear a lot more on maneuvering thrusters trying to hold your ship in place in atmosphere.
And heat, that'll hopefully be a factor as well.
Yeah.
While Item 2.0 brought improvements such as the far-reaching heat system and ship component degradation in 3.5, or thruster misfires and more degradation in 3.6, these things did not change atmospheric flight in any major way. And going back to the Star Citizen style of offering a robust risk versus reward system, hover mode failed this point. Instead, it artificially raised the skill ceiling and told you to follow the rules, counterproductive to the game's mission and restrictive to possible intriguing gameplay complications. This is why hover mode was ultimately scrapped, in my opinion. Not just because there were complaints about the system, but because it did not offer a proper risk versus reward system playing into player choice.
You end up making these decisions that are like hover mode, where you do it and you realize, oh, that's actually taught me something about what this game is. And maybe this isn't the right thing, but it still means that you've progressed closer to that goal, right?
I couldn't have said it better myself, but I'm going to try. Not only are players meant to choose if they are willing to risk the integrity of their ship performance for extra hover time, but they need to have a reason to pick a ship that has purpose-built VTOL thrusters, because they know they will need them for their specific style of gameplay. Hover mode taught us that there is a better way to accomplish what it set out to do. Now, before we dive into this current situation, let's take a look at what the Vehicle Experience team had to say about these developments in January of 2020.
So one of the things that's obviously a well-known upcoming feature this year is the thruster efficiency curves. That's probably like the most explored feature that we're working on at the moment, and part of that necessitates an aerodynamic rebalance of the ships. The ship behaves differently than it has done before, because before the thrusters could overpower the aerodynamics. Now they're not so able to do. And then we're also adding jerk, which is the next derivative after acceleration. So that will make the ships a lot smoother and more dynamic feeling, and maybe not quite as rigid in their movements. And hopefully those two together will really make the ships feel a little bit more interesting motion.
Those two things are sort of what we're trying to get to the end goal of what hover mode was trying to achieve in atmosphere, but doing it a different way.
This brings us to Alpha 3.10 and the new thruster behaviors. In the new update, atmospheric flight will see another big change with the implementation of thruster efficiency curves and updated ship aerodynamics. The goal that John Pritchett laid out for this system years ago. While the rate of acceleration has changed to give ships a more weighty feel both in and outside of atmosphere, there are some very important gameplay changes being made here. Players will now have to make a decision about how they are going to fly their ship. We will no longer be able to dive bomb down towards the city, pull up, and burn to a flat trajectory before smashing into the only Big Benny's cart in the city.
My cabbages!
This is because of two things. First, thrusters will naturally be much weaker in atmosphere due to updated efficiency curves. And second, your ship is going to respond to flight much more differently due to the basic structure of that ship, requiring much more care in the way you fly when in atmosphere. This distinction raises the skill ceiling of atmospheric flight, not by forcing players to abide by the rules, but by giving them the option to take risks and rewarding those who master that slice of gameplay. These changes will bring along with them both positive and negative opportunities to the flight experience. Even more than before, you will be able to conduct velocity bleeding turns to slow down and take advantage of functional flaps on your wings, but you will be exposed to stalls at lower speeds. Wings will make a big difference. The wind will affect your flights, storms can take you out of the air, and broken ship segments could lead to your doom. The overall shape of your ship will have a big impact on flight. The signed distance fields that are meant to be used for the shield calculations will also be used to determine the shape of a ship, rather than just using the cross-section dimensions as before, or even voxelization, as has been done recently.
We dynamically calculate the cross-sectional areas for each ship, so the amount of surface area that comes into play in drag will be unique for every ship.
But there's an extra thing that we're exploring, and we're just kind of in the early ideas of seeing if this would even work, which is using the SDF tech that we're using on the shields to work out the shape of the ship, so that instead of just having like a surface area in front of the ship, we can use the SDF to figure out the actual shape. So for example, a wedge shape like this would behave differently to a shape that's like a flat wall like this, and the SDF would give us that information.
So the game will know whether your ship looks like a wedge or a brick, and will use this function to calculate the proper drag effects on your ship, affecting your maneuverability. All these systems have additional ramifications to what I've already mentioned. This adds more checkboxes to the decision-making list when considering which ships to take planetside. It allows skilled pilots to become more valuable to specific situations. It allows a gameplay element to be easy to pick up, but difficult to master. It makes you constantly consider your fuel levels, wear levels, and damage levels. And above all, it helps with that good old-fashioned immersion. And while these changes certainly bring a lot of new complications into day-to-day flight, there is still one more change that will make a massive difference to atmospheric flight that is due in a later patch. Hover mode failed to make VTOL ships valuable, or to make the pilot experience an easy thing to pick up but difficult one to master. But the devs have a plan for that. Maneuvering thrusters, which every ship has, are made for quick pulses of high thrust used for directional changes, while the more rare and specialized VTOL thrusters are meant for prolonged thrust to maintain a specific altitude. These changes have been publicly discussed since all the way back in 2017, and while the additional thrust capacity was simulated all the way back to 3.0, the resultant power and heat effects along with the risk of damage had not been tied in yet.
As well. Long-term goal, we want to have thrusters performing differently in space and in atmosphere. In space, you've got way more thrust to use, and it's going to be like an impulse effect, so you have these really high accelerations at a very short length of time, so the pilot can manage them, and they're not really high g-force, but for a very short length of time. And the opposite to that is sustained thrust, and that would be what we use in atmosphere. So you have to always be firing these thrusters to stay above the planet. Say gravity, you're fighting gravity with these thrusters, so you get much less performance. Flight, looking at the performance of the ship, and then translating that down into atmospheric, which as a general rule is like, I see it as being 2.5 times less performance, so you've got less acceleration.
Looking past this, as VFX and SFX are further developed to respond to thruster wear, power level, and environment, artists will hopefully be able to easily tailor what we hear and see from each thruster relative to what the thruster is experiencing. And whether you're in atmosphere or in space with things such as atmosphere-driven shock diamonds. Materials will also be used to determine the structural integrity and mass of your ship, affecting your flight style in atmosphere and in space. In addition, working control surfaces will be implemented into ships, and we can expect to see changes to how G-forces are applied to the pilot to increase the sense of thrill and speed. We might also see a long-term planned effect of increased stability at low flight altitudes.
And when you start to get really low, it actually, we're still sort of tuning this, but what we would like is for right on the surface, you actually feel it less. You don't have the turbulence of wind blowing over hills and mountains that you have a little bit higher up in the atmosphere. So when you get lower, it's actually a little bit safer and a little bit more stable than if you were to try and fly a little bit higher.
The ultimate goal of the vehicle experience team, from their own mouths, is to get ships to fly like planes with space influences, in order to get a realistic feel with a cinematic look that is still fun to play.
Been figuring out where's this line between being realistic and being suitable for gameplay. That's really difficult to do. It's really easy to make this perfectly, hyper-realistic simulation, but that's just not fun, unfortunately.
This is not an easy balance to hit and is sure to make fans angry one way or another, but this update will be a big step in a long line of improvements to a flight model that needs some help, and I'm happy to see the progress it has been making. Will these things be perfect upon implementation? Of course not. Will it have all of the desired effects that we're looking for? Oh boy, no. But it's important that it is implemented now and will have continued growth in the future. While it was an expansion of gameplay, I don't think hover mode was the correct answer to the problem we were facing. What seems to be planned sounds more systematic, and I believe was the original plan for hover mode, and though we don't have it yet, I very much am looking forward to it. The aerodynamic changes and efficiency curves that we are seeing right now will add a more weighty feel to the ships that I think players have been begging for quite some time. What do you think of the overall size of this update and the atmospheric effects that are being brought in specifically? Do you think it will fix the issues we see with atmospheric flight, or do you think even more is needed than what I went over in this video? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed these retrospectives, which give everybody an opportunity to look back at the development of big features, make sure to like the video and share it with the rest of the Star Citizen community. And think about joining me on Discord and finding me on Twitch so we can discuss these topics further and play together. And if you want to see more content like this, then consider subscribing to Space Tomato for more Star Citizen content.